Okay, yeah, so I'm Will Sayers. I'm on first year web dev and various other first year modules. I don't think I've taught any of you guys, but I've seen some of you around and interviewed some of you for your future plan stuff. Before I came here, I was working with the University of Oxford in the JR Hospital, working on the back end of some of their genomics processing systems. So they're working on antimicrobial resistance by processing genomes and looking at how they're related to each other. In order to do that, they need to look for people on the back end, which is where I was involved. So who would imagine, out of you guys, that in the NHS they have one big sort of database structure and they share everything together so that they can all work together nicely? Anyone think that? No?
I think through experience they probably know that now.
Yeah. Who would imagine that individual hospitals probably at least have that level? No? Right, so you'd be correct. Essentially what they have is different departments have different ad hoc databases set up by people in those departments usually, sometimes in collaboration with research teams and things like that. Generally they try and share data together, but as you can imagine with different data structures and sometimes completely different database systems, there's all sorts of problems they can run into trying to do that. So this was trying to solve some of that for tuberculosis data, so sharing data about tuberculosis patients between a number of hospitals as part of a research project. All of the different problems that I was talking about. So we actually had 3 hospitals to start with. Hospital 1, 2 and 3, just in case I say something dodgy about it, because some of them are really unpleasant to work with. All feeding data via XML files into secure file storage, which was then imported into a staging database. Okay, so as the data was coming in, it was generally duplicated, all sorts of problems with it, so we feed it to staging, we clean it up. It progresses into the final database where it's clean. Then we have a clinical API, which is just a REST API, okay, which is linked to that database, which is SQL Server 2014, I believe. That feeds data on as the application API, which then feeds it to what you could charitably call data warehouses, so places where people can get data, all right, which are these web front ends here. We also had a bioinformatics section, which I won't go into very much, mostly because I don't know very much about it. It's all written in Python and NoSQL databases, and some of the visualizations and stuff that I've got a video of at the end covering that kind of thing. All right. So this is the main kind of ETL area. That's the web front end area, and that's the bioinformatics part. So to actually get data from these hospital databases, there's quite a lot of work that goes into it. If you end up in this kind of position where you're working on these kind of projects, you'll find that people tend to be quite territorial about their data, even where it's not particularly justified, even where there's permissions in place and things like that. It's all been consented to properly, so you are allowed to share it. So you have to be quite good at working with other people in order to get these agreements in place. And additionally, if you're, and you probably will be, one of the more technical people who are working on these kind of projects, you'll find yourself in a position where you're helping other people on the project do a lot of stuff that really isn't your job, but in order for the project to be successful, it has to be done by somebody. And if they can't do it, that means you're the lucky person that gets to help them. So we had to help them put together a suitable XML extract of their database. So this was just an XML extract using the exact same structure that they already had in their database. Conduct a schema that they could verify that against. So I assume you've all done like XML schemas and structures and things like that right now. And then set up an account on the server and help them usually to set up a proper automated process that will get that data and move it onto our servers. So we then had to translate this XML data into a structure that our database could actually use and that our researchers knew about and could understand. In order to do this, we used XSLT, which is a pretty standard way of doing it, but because we were working with medical consultants, researchers, biologists, bioinformaticians, people who aren't computer scientists at all, and because we needed their help to generate these XSLTs, because we needed the knowledge of what the data actually represented that they could provide, we needed a visual way to represent this. So we used a visual ETL tool, which then generated the XSLT code that we were going to use to do the actual transformations. Right? So the transformations can get pretty complicated. That's one for one hospital. This actually ended up being about 3 times as long as that. That was the initial version, and then it went even further because the data wasn't structured properly as it turned out after this. Some of them were slightly more simpler, so these two are kind of like if-then rules and adding in some extra data and context. So our data structure looked like that, which is, it looks fairly complicated. It took quite a while to come up with it properly. Basically, you have to properly understand, as I said, with the help of all the clinicians and consultants and people that you're working with, the structure of the data that you're trying to incorporate into your own data structure, so that you can then build a structure that will encompass that and won't lose anything along the way. And if you're doing that for multiple different people, multiple different data structures coming in, you have to understand all of them if you want to do it properly. So this was kind of built off some structures that someone else had developed before, and then iteratively designed over a process of about 3 weeks. Just to give you an idea, I've got an example of, there's some commercial software called Mirth that works with this sort of data, but on a much more general scale, if you like, not the kind of specificity that we were getting into. And that was their first draft of their data structure. It's actually more complicated than that now. Again, about 3 times as long as that. So when we move data into staging, the staging database doesn't enforce any kind of integrity between the relationships between the different bits of data inside it. Okay? So it's just a collection of unrelated tables, essentially. And that's deliberate because as the data comes in, it's often incomplete. So essentially, the way that hospitals did it was by snapshotting their database as it stood at a certain moment in time and feeding that through to us, which meant that we got incomplete records, records that were partially complete, all these sorts of messy things. So by putting them into staging, we can then go through them in staging and build up a complete record from each one. So the data sits in staging as various updates come into it, and then there's a piece of software that we wrote in C# called the import compiler, which goes through everything in these databases, matches them together, and figures out which records that have been added in and are actually updates to already existing records, squashes them together, if you like, and then feeds them into final. So it then also has to clear out duplicate records, which is where hospitals feed data through to our system, or fed data through to our system in the past. They will add data, and because it's all manually added to a database, which is pretty common, you end up with a system where there's very messy data coming in. So one nurse might add someone with a certain spelling of their name, another nurse might add someone new because she can't find them with the spelling that she was expecting, and you end up with 2 patients that actually are the same person. So the import compiler also add a section called record linkage, which went through this and basically, using heuristic algorithms, matched up different patients' information in order to try and figure out which patients were actually the same patient and which patients were genuinely different. Right. There's a paper written by a guy called John Finney, who I was working with at the time, who developed this algorithm. And there's various other approaches used in industry and Merck as well, but his algorithm is the best. I think it gets about 98% accuracy, which is very good for this kind of data. Okay, so the clinical API was written in .NET again. It basically just feeds the data from this final database to web applications at the front end. Then the application API connects everything together. So it connects the genetics API and the clinical API together. Basically, there's identifiers within genetic data which has to be anonymized. And you can match them against identifiers within the clinical data. All right? These two have to be kept separate up until this point, because whilst you're, for reasons of, for legal reasons essentially, whilst you're processing the genetic data, you have to keep it anonymized. You can only de-anonymize it once you have finished processing it, because they strip certain stuff out of it as it's going through. So things like, for example, they'd get lots of HIV positive DNA samples, but they were not authorised to diagnose that particular problem. So they had to strip that data out before it went anywhere near being actually identified for researchers. Okay, so there's all sorts of really important things like that, because they could get in an awful lot of trouble for essentially telling people they had something that they didn't, or even telling people they had something that they did, but they weren't allowed to diagnose it. Okay. So LabKey is a Java system, Java front end. Essentially what we did was build a import into LabKey in Java now, so we've got loads of different technologies working together for this, which just took a snapshot of our data and made it available in LabKey. I doubt anyone's seen LabKey working in a lab, but it just kind of loads up. It looks like a kind of Excel table, and then lets you do filtering and certain kinds of graphs and things on data within the application. It's horrible to work with. You can avoid it, do, but you might not be able to. And then various other applications, one of which I've got a video of that I can show you. So various ways of visualizing this data to make it actually useful for the clinicians who wanted to work with it, because essentially our clinical data, what I mean by that is it's a list of patient information. This patient came into hospital on this date, they were here for this amount of time in this ward, they presented with this problem, then they left, or in some cases they never left, which is good. All sorts of information like that. And then genetic data is the results of various genetic tests that have been done on them to identify whether samples taken from them actually contain tuberculosis. So, I've just got a video now, which hopefully will play. This isn't using the actual data that I was using, because for obvious reasons I can't show it to people. But these are the visualizations that were done with that particular data. Okay? So this is actually using some software called PyInteractive, which some people I was working with developed, and it's available on GitHub as open source. It lets you type in code into Python and then visualize it nicely like this in JavaScript libraries. So they were doing things like this cluster detection to see where outbreaks of TB were occurring in the country based on the connection between the clinical and the genetic data, and then which particular species were actually present in those areas, which let them then identify whether it was being transmitted across, if it's the same species, or whether it's completely separate, which can come up with some interesting results actually. They had one case where I think 3 people on the ward had 3 completely separate families. You'd assume they all got it from each other, but they were nothing to do with each other. Just ignore the green here.
So the people that developed this tool were a separate team, were they?
They were, well, one of them was another developer So I was on the software engineering team, and it was me and Laura, John, and Oriel, I think. It was the guy who was working on this from that team. And then Carlos, who was his friend from Spain, he worked on it with him. He was on the bioinformatics team. He was pretty much the head of the bioinformatics team unofficially. So he was well aware of the title effects. He was well aware of all the different visualizations that were useful for that type of stuff. Because we were working in a research environment, essentially, although we weren't and we were all allowed to use whichever tools and languages we preferred, which worked well in some ways, but also meant that there was a massive mishmash of different languages being used. So all the ETL stuff that I was talking about was done in XSLTs, and then .NET, C#, and SQL code. All the bioinformatics stuff was in C++ and Python, and then all of the web front-end visualization stuff was in Java and JavaScript, HTML, CSS, as you'd expect. I mean, most of this is, the premise of this is essentially JavaScript visualization libraries that already existed, but then linking them to Python code at the back end of this particular bit of software.
What was the Python code doing? It was just sort of putting out data.
It's forming back end, so it's running like a web server on the back end, essentially, but loading up local data and then letting you visualize it into the JavaScript. Essentially, because Carlos was looking through all the JavaScript visualization libraries and was really jealous, and so he wrote some software to link it all together.
So, out of interest, obviously this tool was finally built. What did it offer?
Well, like I was saying, the essentially linking these databases together, okay, is, like I was saying at the beginning, it sounds like the kind of thing that hospitals should be doing already, but they're really not. To the point where when my boss at the time, who's head of Public Health England now, went to a software team at PHE and asked them to do it, they told him that it would be impossible to do, which it clearly isn't because we did it. So yeah, it's the first kind of time that this has been done, even for something as small as TB, and therefore the aim was that we'd come up with a system that was generalisable enough that we could use it with other problems in exactly the same way. So we almost got there. I think there's more research that needs to be done by other people to really get it to that stage, because the problem was that the transformations had to be built by hand each time. Some of them were quite quick, so I did all the ones that you saw in the presentation there, and the two simpler ones took about a week each, but the Birmingham one took about 2 weeks of my time, and that's obviously not sustainable when you've got loads of them going on, unless you've got a team of Amazon turtles or something doing it. Yeah, so what they need is some way to come up with a system that could analyse a data structure and transform it automatically, but we're getting into really complex research stuff there. So.
Cool. You got any questions, guys? I mean, it's complete. In some respects, it's a completely different strand of web development design. In some respects, you'd never thought of it. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought that you'd ever.
I didn't really think that we could mix and mash that many things together.
I think that's why that guy probably said it was impossible, because just the thought of it.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of. I probably wasn't the brightest person working there, so I don't think I'd be egotistical saying it. It takes a lot of very bright people working together to make this kind of stuff happen. But some of the results from it were massively useful, and actually some of the same software, just as I left in the middle of the project, so I don't know how it went in the end, but some of the same software was being used to investigate superbug outbreaks in Manchester, I believe. I think that was breaking news, I can say that now, I couldn't at the time. Yeah, so Manchester had an outbreak of superbugs, and they were using the same software to try and track how it was being transmitted. So that's the kind of thing. And it is still web development, even though it's using .NET, Java, various other things.
You mentioned, in fact, sort of the space when you were mentioning it, the XML, XSLT, all that sort of thing. To Laura, obviously, that, and I appreciate it in some respect because I don't think XML was, well, probably still, I know it still is, but it's sort of, from a web development perspective, it's sort of shifting its paradigm into JSON.
Yes.
And so if I said JSON to you, would that mean that?
Yeah, I know what it is.
Yeah, so that, Laura is obviously clear about what JSON is.
Yeah,
But
totally.
then, weirdly enough, Laura, XML is probably what you should know. You need to be aware of it because now, to some extent, one reason why perhaps so is because I know for a fact that you maybe just mentioned it in a lecture. We have actually taught the principles of XML because web development has shifted into JSON.
Yeah.
But the fact that you brought back XML and the fact that was that universal language to transfer data
Together,
in one to one language.
I think I would feel a place for us to transfer XML from PHP we got into JSON to store it, which was boring.
But then the strange, I don't know, there probably is, but I don't think it's been really established. But XSLTs, do you know what they is, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're basically, they're called schemas, as far as I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, but they're schemas that basically check the integrity of the data. Is that right?
So XSLTs, it's almost like a functional programming language that you can build as a schema to say, for this XML file, process the data in this way and output another XML file. And it was part of the reason that we went with XML over JSON actually, because there was this built-in way in XML engines to transform the data, whereas I'm not aware of the same thing kind of existing with JSON data. It's where you could use JavaScript, but nobody wanted to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, but I remember using XML and SSLT and all this sort of. All I recall using it for was to sort of make sure, because I think lots of the time, if this data that was inputted into the system did not match sort of data types, the contents that it's meant to be, it would never upload. It would say, look, I'm not going to go any further because you want to make this XML file, but the data you put for this node doesn't match the schema, doesn't match what it's meant to be.
Exactly, yeah, that's the XSDs, yeah.
Ah, that's it, yeah.
And I think some technology does exist for doing JSON schemas and verifying against them, but it's not very widely used.
Widely used, that's right.
Yeah, whereas in XML it is quite widely used, and it's a very good thing because one of the main benefits of these sort of structured textual means of transferring data around is that there is a structure to it, and if there's a structure it means it can be verified, which means that you can check that you're getting what you should be getting.
Yes.
Although we did run into some issues where people would give us, for the Manchester Superbug thing, we were given a bunch of data as a one-off custom XML extraction by some of the software engineers in that hospital. And that had sort of strange things in the XML that we hadn't considered they might send us, and we ended up having to dig through and find a bug fix, like names with question marks inside and stuff like that just made the processor throw an easy fit.
This was that essentially was raw data coming from their system.
Yeah, essentially,
apparently had a question marks in the.
Yes, yes.
Do you think that was special characters?
It must have either been some kind of special character or just a typo, because as I said, nurses have been typing it in, so if they've made a mistake, with thousands of patients, so lots of various mistakes that can make show up.
Yeah, that was like simple things. So when they're gonna blog posts from WordPress, if you want to edit that thing on your website, it comes in XML. So to edit that, I had to go on SQL and edit the XML from SQL to get rid of things I didn't want to and add like classes or whatever from their SQL into their XML to do it, which was
very tedious.
Yeah, it's very, it took ages for something very simple.
Yeah, I have to say the bit that I most enjoyed was writing the C# code, which did a fairly simple job of discovering when an XML file had come in, then running the translation engine, and then copying things into the right folders.
Okay.
It wasn't. I didn't particularly enjoy having to do all the translations and transformations. But what was really nice about working on these kind of projects was knowing that the work that I was doing was pretty much immediately, within 6 months, being used to save people's lives. So these kind of areas in web development do exist, and you can get into them.
It's fascinating to think that you never know what sort of strand you're going to be in. I don't know if you ever thought you were going to be interested in doing that sort of thing, or whether you...
No. Well, my PhD was all on AI and stuff, and I started off doing game development and C#. Military software actually was my first job, and then I sort of fell into this, and I think I just talked at the interview enough that they thought I'd be able to figure it out.
Right.
That's about it, really.
Okay.
But yeah, it worked out well, and I learned a lot there as well because with the kind of environment it was, although I was officially a software engineer and doing mostly web-based stuff, there was almost a DevOps element to it as well. So I helped out with a lot of the deciding what servers we needed, going down to the server room and actually wiring things together and installing servers and stuff. So that was good too. And I had to, basically, they assumed that software engineers knew everything, I think. So it's just like, go down and fix the computers well. Okay.
Fascinating. I think it's well, just to finish up, I think what's fascinating is that the job roles, whether you, it's unlikely quite you one day you'll come back to this union and say, I did this. But you're going to have to rely on, but to appreciate that there are other people out there doing a job, for you to do your job in some respect. Because obviously these clinicians, these people are thinking, well, I can't do my bit until this team has done this diagrammatical visualization for us.
Yes.
And it's just crazy to think that those guys are a bit dependent on people like Will or whoever is in this team, or more like yourself. So at some point, you're part of the bigger picture. It's kind of strange to think that.
You'll probably find yourself in positions as well where you're working with people who you're completely reliant on working as a team with, like we were with those clinicians, because in order to know how to structure the data properly and how to present it properly at the end, and know which bits we could lose, which bits we couldn't, and so on, we didn't have an understanding of the data because none of us were medically trained at all. So we knew very little, that we basically had to keep going back and forth to them. We had to help them understand it, and they had to help us understand it, and it was very, very team-oriented to actually getting an output at the end.
Okay, guys. Well, thanks, Will. That was really interesting. I think topic for me, anyway.